So hi everyone, I'm Shani Danda and I am a Work With Me ambassador. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all today to our webinar, which is all around how to make your business neurodiversity smart. We have a lot of people joining us today who may not have joined us before and who may not know what Work With Me is. And if that is you, Work With Me is a network of businesses that support each other in becoming more inclusive for disabled people. If you're not a member yet, it's absolutely free to join and sign up and become part of the community. We have many different online opportunities to share experiences and good practice, and we also have a cool series of webinars too. So I'm just going to quickly go through some housekeeping before we get going. If you do have background noise, it'd be great if you could go on to mute. And if you feel comfortable, you can leave your video on, but that's totally up to you. We will be recording the discussion part of the presentation that Aidan goes through, but then we'll stop recording when we come to the questions to respect the safe and honest space that we want to create. And throughout the session, if you do have any questions, do put those into the chat box and then we'll read them and come to them in the Q&A session at the end. So just before we get going, I'd like to introduce Aidan. So we're joined by Aidan, who is the CEO of Lexxic, and Lexxic is a specialist consultancy who are leaders in the field of neurodiversity in the workplace. Their consultancy has a 13-year track record and they partner with organisations to empower neurodiverse talent and deliver strategic change programmes. And Aidan is on a mission to create a working world that includes and empowers neurodiverse talent. He has 15 years of experience in people development roles, holding qualifications in psychology, leadership, development, and coaching. So we are definitely in really good hands today to talk about this topic. Over to you, Aidan.
Good morning, everybody. How are you? Just before I get started, can I just get a validation? Camera, microphone is all good?
Yeah.
Great. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I think I have the joy and the challenge of giving you a briefing on this morning's subject. The joy being it's a subject both myself and Lexxic are very passionate about. The challenge is we have about 35 minutes to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. So what I'm going to try and do with you this morning is talk a little bit about what is neurodiversity, why you should care, your organization should care, and what are some of the high-level things you might reflect on and what you might do about it. Thank you for the kind introduction and just a reminder, I suppose, about Lexxic and what we do. We really work with organizations in one of three ways, and I'm going to kind of touch on these three ways this morning. The first being very much working with the individual one-to-one in a professional psychological capacity. The second is a range of kind of specialist programs, education and training. And the final one is very much in around organizational change. And I guess, you know, I know Work With Me, your invitation is to kind of make disability your business. And I think Lexxic very much has the same lens and the same values, that while it is so great to see charities and social enterprises and lots of organizations out there advocating passionately for this space, how do we actually translate this into the business setting? Or how do we get a leadership team to buy into the kind of positive change we'd like to make? But before talking about that, I think it is worth being clear on this word, which is what is neurodiversity and what do we mean when we talk about neurodiversity? So for us, neurodiversity is commonly used as an umbrella term to describe individuals with dyslexia, dyspraxia or DCD, dyscalculia, ADHD and those in the autism spectrum. And the reason I want to give a little bit of time first to talk about what is neurodiversity is it's not a universally agreed term. Sometimes it can include things like Tourette's or other cognitive functioning challenges, but this is what we will focus on today. For those looking for kind of the more academic definition, or a lot of times when we look up what is neurodiversity, we get an answer like this, which is it refers to the differences in brain function and behavioral traits regarded as part of normal variation in the human population. If I can kind of simplify that and really, if this is the slide to focus on, I think for me, on what neurodiversity is. We call it, we say it's a big word to describe a simple idea, which is neuro, referring to our brains, and diversity, meaning a range of differences and different types. And if you think about our journey as organizations, we've come to value many different types of people in the workplace. We've come to value different types of profiles and personalities and skills. But what about different types of brains? And what neurodiversity, I think, at its heart is asking us to do is not just look at the deficit. If we take something like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD, imagine being given a label that has the word deficit and disorder in its name. How does that person feel, or what are the associations we make when that person talks about having ADHD, particularly in a workplace setting? And I think it's very important that to kind of acknowledge this shame and this feeling of not feeling empowered can start quite early. This is data from the British Dyslexia Association showing that about 85% of parents report their children are embarrassed by their dyslexia. And especially when it comes to children, it's worth asking, well, why is that? Why are they embarrassed or maybe feel that something is wrong with them? And it's not because of their reading and writing capabilities. I think it's because the system, the people, the culture often rejects them for their challenges in these areas and often doesn't give them a chance to show what else they're capable of. And when you think about people with neurodifferences or neurodiversity in the workplace, it's often a feeling of being different. And even if you don't have a neurodifference yourself, I think we all know the feeling of being made feel who we are or something about us is to something, or it's a deficit in some other area. So what neurodiversity is asking us to do, what the neurodiversity movement is asking us to do, is not just to focus on the negatives. For example, this is data made by Dyslexia, their Connecting the Dots report. And what they did is they asked people with dyslexia to associate certain things with themselves and compared that to members of the public. And as we can see in the bottom two here, when we think about the challenges of dyslexia, there is an awful lot more alignment than some of the strengths of dyslexia, or some of the strengths people with dyslexia very much feel about themselves. And this gap, when it comes to the workplace and this stigma, allows us, really leads to people with dyslexia actually not coming forward, not asking for support, and leading a life that is quite hidden. So I guess that's a short high-level summary of what neurodiversity is. I think at its heart, it's asking us not to be problem-focused, but also to be solution-focused. So when we think about ADHD or someone being hyperactive, that person can also be energetic and enthusiastic and very much on the go. If we think about someone with autism, maybe as being inflexible, those people can actually really thrive in roles that at their core require structure and routine. And fundamentally, we're working towards our vision here in Lexxic, which is a world where all minds belong. No matter what kind of brain or mind you have, we want to feel like you belong. So that's neurodiversity. I think the second natural question is, that is a really good ethical argument, moral argument, social argument, and we make these kinds of arguments all the time in business. But why should an organization invest in this space? Why should we give our limited resources and time and energy to invest in this when we have so many other competing demands and challenges? And for this, I would say a few things. Number one, people with neurodifferences already make up a large part of the population, approximately 1 in 7, according to data from ACAS, but those estimates do vary depending on the cutoff points you make. But the data can flow between 1 in 10 and up to 1 in 6 or 1 in 5. And so if you think about your employees, if you think about future talent, if you think about your customers, if we're working on the assumption that 1 in 7 of them may have a neurodifference, do you know who they are? Have you ever spoken to them? How do they feel about working in your organization? How do they feel about your employer brand? And if your answer is, well, we're not sure because we've never had that conversation, it's certainly not something to feel ashamed about. This is data from CIPD showing that only about 10% of the HR professionals they surveyed actually included neurodiversity in their people management practices. So I think the gap here is we have millions and millions of people in society wanting to work, wanting to engage, wanting to join our organizations. And yet when they walk in the door and maybe want to share who they are, there are a number of barriers in place that don't always make that a positive experience. I think the kind of first way many organizations look at neurodiversity is they look at it through the lens of the Equality Act. Under the Equality Act, neurodifferences can be seen as a disability or a hidden disability. And obviously, there is a duty of care to employees not to discriminate against a person when it comes to any aspect of the employment process. And very quickly, this can start to go wrong when an employer or when an organization doesn't have awareness. I'll give you a very simple example of a recent case. This was an estate agent who had ADHD. She was referred to as her employer as being high maintenance. The employer victimized her and failed to make reasonable adjustments. But I think it's the second paragraph that really kind of resonates true to us in Lexxic, which is their decisions were based on an extremely limited understanding of what ADHD was, based merely on an internet search. So we have this duty as employers not to discriminate, to make reasonable adjustments. We know the kind of things that can go wrong when we don't make those changes, and yet very few of us have this on our agenda. And to kind of, this is often a point when we're talking about neurodiversity where people go, well, hang on a minute. Neurodiversity is about different types of brains. It's about accepting people for who they are. And yet when it comes to employment law, we're talking about disability and impairments and people being different and needing adjustments. And I think sometimes this is where we can get into maybe a confusion sometimes between, say, the medical model, which often puts the responsibility on the individual, or the social model, which can put the responsibility more on society and an organization. And I think what I would say about this is when we talk about, say, not pathologizing autism, I think what we're saying is, just because someone has autism, we shouldn't assume their differences are always problems. But that doesn't mean that some people with autism may not have impairments. And some people with autism may just be looking for acceptance. You know, I don't particularly enjoy engaging with social activities. Is it okay if I step out of this? Other people might feel, actually, I really want to engage in this. I really want to engage in this social activity. Maybe I really want to do something and I'm looking for assistance. So I think sometimes this question of acceptance and assistance can divide us as organizations. But I think what I would suggest is some people will want acceptance and some people will want assistance. And it is fundamentally a mixture of both. So when we don't look at this space, it creates a certain reality for us in many organizations. We end up being reactionary. We end up speaking to people when they're in crisis, late in their journey, or they end up disclosing in the disciplinary hearing, in the performance management hearing, in the dismissal hearing. Or low levels of awareness of what neurodifferences are lead to unaddressed stigma. It leads to a lot of employer and manager confusion. It leads to unclear and unestablished processes, stress, tribunals, retention, presenteeism, and so on and so forth. But I think for us, what we see in Lexxic a lot is just lost time. So often when organizations approach us, we hear again and again, if we'd just known about this earlier, we would have saved ourselves so much time. And while time isn't a hard cost, there is often a cost related to it. And I guess what we're trying to do as we talk about this is become neurodiversity smart, helping individuals feel supported, valued, understood, and helping our organization shift towards a more positive culture. And I guess this is really what I want to touch on now for the remainder of my presentation, which is what can we do? And as I talk about what can we do, my invitation is this is not a one size fits all or a series of steps or a model that can be applied to every organization. Please treat it as a series of lenses by which you can look at through your own organizations, through your own cultures, as what changes we might be able to make. So how do we start integrating supports, and what do those supports look like? So to go back to this slide of this person saying, I have dyslexia, what are the traditional kinds of supports and services and reasonable adjustments that are available? The kind of most traditional services are generally divided into three areas, which is a screening or diagnostic assessment. And in that, a professional, a psychologist, if it's autism or ADHD, it might be a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, will use a range of assessment tools to determine whether or not a person does have or is demonstrating the tendencies of a specific condition. So I think I might have dyslexia. Okay, well, a screening or diagnostic will maybe help us understand if that's the case. The second of these is traditionally a workplace needs assessment. This is where, again, someone will work with the employee to evaluate their current role, to evaluate their current setup, and recommend equipment, assistive technology, or other reasonable adjustments along the way. And finally, I think there is one-to-one coaching, which is actually working with people through the emotional journey, through their beliefs, through their attitudes, through how they feel about themselves. And I think if I want to be very clear, the journey of change for someone with a neurodifference is emotional as much as it is practical. Giving someone an exercise bike does not automatically mean they know how to use it, or they're going to engage in it, or they're going to suddenly be a healthy person. It's a very positive step, but there is a lot of emotional and personal factors that often need to be worked through as well when we talk about change. Just to give you examples of what this might look like, what adjustments might look like, I think one is to look at the area of assistive technology, for example. So there are programs out there, some free, some paid, that will support people with neurodifferences, helping process the world around them in a different way. So for example, a text-to-speech software. I find it difficult if I have dyslexia, if I have ADHD, to read a 20-page document for this meeting. So actually, if I can convert that to audio, I'm able to engage with that material in a very different way. Things like capturing information, live scribe pens that will capture text in a document, or a range of software that will translate links, audio, images, text into different formats that make it more available. Speech to text, again, is helping someone dictate. That's often very useful if there's challenges with writing or transcribing. And again, software like mind mapping can really help capture ideas, planning, organization in different ways. And again, reasonable adjustments are about that. It's not about changing your whole organization. It's not about spending thousands and thousands of pounds. Often small and simple steps can really, really make a big difference. This is a cartoon that has always resonated with me, which is, here are the draft guidelines on managing a paperless office. And I guess as an organization that is on the receiving end as a service provider, having the services in place is a really good first step. So if you don't have a provider, it's important to get one, whether it's Lexxic, whether it's occupational health, whether it's access to work. There's lots of different options out there. But actually getting those services and getting people to engage with those services is a very sometimes different conversation. And I think what I would touch on here is, well, what's the point in having them if users can't or won't use them? And I would say there's a number of things we see again and again in relation to this. The first is your IT department or your HR department tends to say no. So there's a lot of processes, a lot of steps, a lot of difficulty in getting assistive technology installed or in actually getting through the referral process. Stigma. One of the analogies I can use with this, in a former role, I used to work quite closely with the app Headspace, which I'm sure many of you know from mindfulness and meditation, or you may know Calm, which is the other big app that's often integrated into organizations. If you think about wanting to get access to Headspace and your organization said, okay, we can do that. We'd like you to disclose to your line manager, disclose to HR. We're going to send you to a professional to assess your levels of stress or if you need mindfulness, and only then will we give you access to Headspace. Clearly, that is a lot of barriers, and a lot of us would not be willing to have those conversations. So when we think about accessing services and accessing supports, how can you make it mainstream? How can you make it simple? And I think very much points 3 and 4 touch on that, which is engagement, training with line managers, with HR, and providing a context as to why we're offering these types of services. And of course, focusing on the benefits, not just the condition itself. Are people with dyslexia the only ones who could benefit from a text-to-speech software? Are people with dyslexia the only ones who can struggle with reading and writing and processing information? Of course not. Some of these adjustments we can look at a more systemic level. And I think that's a very important point to note. So that's number one, which is kind of the whole area of starting with services. If you don't have these kinds of services, these kinds of referral processes in place, if they're not clear, it's really not, you know, we often see organizations do this in reverse, which is let's run loads of awareness sessions and then bring forward lots of people who want to talk about their neurodifferences with really nowhere for them to go. And from a compliance perspective, from a getting started perspective, I think building the safety net for your organization and working from there so it's more inclusive and less stigmatizing is a very important first step. Once organizations have done that, once you've kind of started once you've met your compliance requirements, I think where we see a lot of organizations transition to is the business case, which is actually, okay, if we want to go beyond this as a compliance, as a challenge to be managed, what is our overarching vision? Do we have any data to support that vision? And how do we convince senior leaders that actually this has to move beyond compliance? And I think one of the things we see a lot when we're working with employee resource groups, HR teams, and others, when it comes to the business case, to think beyond compliance, to think beyond social and moral obligations. Think about neurodiversity across your organization. So how could empowering people with neurodifference help organizational performance? If 1 in 7 people out there have a neurodifference, how does this become part of the talent conversation, the recruitment conversation, the development conversation? And actually, if we're thinking about our employer brand, how do those 1 in 7 people out there feel about us as an organization? And so often, I think we find if we look at this just through one lens as a HR initiative, as a disability initiative, as a D&I initiative, of, well, we don't have the budget for that, or that is a good thing to do, but it's not a business priority right now. And so when thinking about your business case, when thinking about going beyond a compliance, I would try and look at a wider pool of resources and a wider pool of budgets to get support for yourself. The third thing I would think about in terms of being neurodiversity smart. So, okay, we've built a safety net, we've got our service providers, we've got maybe a business case and a vision. How do we now then start rolling this out across the organization? How do we start actually engaging people beyond maybe our current service users? And of course, awareness raising workshops, events are a good place to start, but they shouldn't be considered comprehensive training. Is there post-training support? Is there facilitated sessions? Is there a platform? Is there a place where people can go get information easily and talk about this? Because you can have really great supports and services, but I'll give you an example of this. We just finished an impact study with a large organization that about 50% of their managers really understood the concept and 50% didn't. And this was an organization that had spent over 6 figures a year for 4, 5, 6 years. So really the work doing in empowering line managers and educating line managers is a very big part of making the shift. And the reason I put up this report from Ernst & Young on the value of dyslexia is so often when we think about education, we think about support, we think about the challenges. I have sat at conferences where people talk about autism and dyslexia, and 95% of their presentation is the supports they need, the challenges they have, the difficulties they may run into. And I find myself sitting there going, if I'm a manager, why am I buying into this? Or this can sound like a lot of effort. And so it is very much about values and strengths-based approach. I think I would never underestimate the power of people with neurodifferences supporting one another, and also the really positive work they can do if you empower them through an employee resource group, a peer support network, or a mentoring scheme. We have seen employee resource groups do amazing things with, £5,000 of investment that HR has not been able to do with £25,000. And that passion, those personal stories, that even, going above and beyond and volunteering to make change in organizations beyond existing roles can make a huge, huge difference. And I think the other thing, and I'll touch on this point again, which is in organizations, we can get very caught up in what's the condition? Does this person have the condition or not have the condition? Whereas really the conversation needs to be about what are the barriers? And again, are people with ADHD the only people who struggle with attention or time management or sitting still for long periods of time? Of course not. And there are really positive adjustments, positive assistive technology, positive guides and resources that can be made available to everyone. And actually, if they are made available to everyone, the culture becomes less about, figuring out if someone has a condition and we will support you over here as long as you meet the criteria for the condition and we have the budget for that because we have a legal duty, versus actually what are the barriers people with neurodifferences and many of us in our own ways face to make that change. So that's number 3, which is about culture. Number 4 is recruitment processes. So we have services, we have a good business case, our culture is starting to develop more positively. Actually, could we start now to look at talent? Could we actually start to look at our opportunity to attract more people with neurodifferences to our organization? Or could we look at our current processes and see how they might be filtering out certain candidates? I put up an example of the Autism at Work virtual career fair that took place a few months ago. And many organizations are now designing and developing recruitment programs specifically for people with neurodifferences, specifically looking for the strengths and talents that they bring. There is a what would I say, a risk to some of this. I know some people feel if you look at the organizations sponsoring and taking part in the Autism at Work Careers Fair, it's very much a tech, banking, mechanical kind of piece. And we do run the risk of everyone with autism being labeled as being good at coding, and that it's important not to entirely go down that route. So I guess when it comes to recruitment processes, what I would say is, do you give people an opportunity to disclose through your selection processes when they're applying? Is that something as part of your process? Job descriptions, forms, application processes. So often in organizations, when we are advertising for roles, we say things like, must be an excellent communicator, must have excellent written and writing skills, must be excellent at time management. And when people see that on your job descriptions, they can disassociate themselves from applying for that role. And I would encourage organizations to think about when you're looking for specific roles, to think about your language or the criteria sometimes we just put on every organization, every job role, and how it might exclude people. So if someone with autism sees, I need to have outstanding communication skills for this role, they may not apply for that role. But if we're really asking ourselves, does this role require outstanding communication skills? Does this role require outstanding literacy skills? And where do we go from there? Application forms, interview formats, there are a lot of things that can be done in relation to this. For example, people with dyslexia, their short-term memory can often become overloaded. So on-the-spot questioning, very long interview formats may actually disempower someone's initiative. If your interview panels are not familiar with autism, they may often subconsciously filter someone out. They'll say, oh, well, they didn't make eye contact. They didn't seem to get the subtlety of what we were saying. And again, we lose talent and we lose candidates throughout this process that could make really outstanding employees in our organizations. And similarly, there are a whole pool of neurodiverse candidates out there who may not be applying for your organization because they don't see it as neurodiversity friendly. And my last point on this, because I am conscious I have about 2 minutes left, is to think about how people perceive you. One of the simplest ways to do this is to type in your organization's name and neurodiversity or dyslexia or autism or dyscalculia or ADHD into Google and see what comes up. Because that is often what members of the public, candidates, current employees are doing when they are thinking about your brand. So if I'm applying to work for you, is the first few results on Google blogs from people in your organization with neurodifferences? Is it a link to your D&I page showing the recruitment process? Is it a campaign you've run? And there are some organizations where the first result that comes up is the Glassdoor review, where it's a negative experience, the Equality Tribunal outcome, the media reporting on the Equality Tribunal outcome. And, you know, being neurodiversity smart is showcasing externally your commitment and helping people with neurodifferences, helping your managers, helping your HR team to talk about and share those stories so it shifts perception in your organization and your organization externally as well. So to kind of wrap up what that last 40 minutes was about, I did try and give you a lot. I hope it wasn't too much, but I thought, you know, given the short session, I would try and cover a lot at a relatively high level. The heart of the neurodiversity movement, different brains. We think about different types of people. We think about different personalities, Myers-Briggs, team profiles. What about different brains? Why should organizations care? Well, first, you have a duty of care. It's the law. It's your legal responsibility. But there are also so many strengths and opportunities and benefits to organizations in making an initial investment. It could be lost time, it could be empowering people, it could be the right thing to do, it could be talent. There are a lot of positive benefits. And how you can go about doing that, compliance is very much the foundation. Then I would look at your business case, your reasons for doing it beyond, because if you don't have that business case, often it becomes, oh, well, this is a problem to be managed. We're managing the problem well. We're doing our job. Shifting culture, you are not going to shift individual disclosure levels, how individuals feel about themselves, if they step back into an environment where their managers, colleagues, and teams judge them. The fourth part is then to think about your recruitment processes, future talent. And the fifth, I think, as well, is your employer brand. And for me, this becomes a cycle of collective change. By changing individuals, you know, by even making one person's life and empowering them, they will talk about you as an employer. They will share their story with their team. They will share their story with a manager. They may join a group. There is huge benefits in just making a change to one individual and huge benefits, obviously, in changing the systems around us as well. So I am 1 minute over. Apologies. I'm excited about questions and comments. Somebody sent me a really nice meme about 2 weeks ago, which I'm going to put up, which is not working in 2019 versus not working in 2020. So I would love to hear questions, comments, challenges. You know, we have about 18 minutes. I'm very happy to stay longer to really engage with you and hopefully support you on your journey. So thank you for listening.